Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Reed, and welcome to In the Heat of the Page, Coping with the Root Cause of Incident Stress. We're going to be talking today a little bit about incidents, incident command, and stress in those incidents, and what we can do about that. I wanted to give a special shout out. I know with the unique year that we're all experiencing, this has changed the world in terms of online events, and so thanks to PagerDuty and all of the organizers to bring us all together, even though we can't be physically together, and creating a space for us to share stuff about information and learnings about all this sort of stuff. So I want to start our talk and our session today with a little bit of a vignette. And I want you to, as you watch this, pay particular attention not only to what you feel during this video, but as the events in the video unfold, sort of pay attention to when you feel those particular feelings. It might even be good to get a pad of paper and maybe just jot down kind of what you feel and maybe in the order that you feel it. So let's watch what happens here. Now that was pretty wild. If you took some notes on what you felt and maybe when you felt it, set those aside because we're going to come back and talk about maybe some of the things that you felt during that, and then how that's related to incidents and why that matters. So a little bit about myself. This is the standard about me slide. I'm not going to go through all of it. Probably the two most important bits of information on here are my Twitter handle. I'm at jpaulreed on Twitter, so you can tweet me out things. If you have questions or observations about this talk or anything else, feel free to reach me there. And then also the last bit, I have a master's in human factors and system safety. I mention that because a lot of the concepts that we're going to be talking about today come from the field of human factors and system safety. And that's kind of the framing about a lot of the lens through which we're going to look at a lot of these topics. And also I'm on the core team at Neflix, keeping this streaming service up and running. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about the stories that we tell, and that's going to really serve as the underpinning for us to talk through the root cause of stress and incidents, which is next. And then we're going to look at a couple of ways that we might be able to tell less stressful stories and, in effect, reduce some of that stress that we might feel during an incident. So first, the stories that we tell. So this bit of the talk is a little theoretical. It's based on research that's been being ongoing right now. And I wanted to take you all on this journey because it really is the underpinning of the rest of the theory around where some of the stress that we feel in incidents comes from. So storytelling. We're going to be talking a lot about some of the work that Jay Bloom has been doing. He's finishing up his PhD in design at Carnegie Mellon. And one of the interesting questions that he's been asking from a design perspective is, how do you design things that have incredibly long lifespans? So he's asking questions like, how do we design a city that has a 300-year or 500-year expected sort of lifespan of a city, or maybe even more? What does design even mean? How can we intentionally design an object or an artifact or even a system of artifacts like a city in a way that makes sense? He kind of describes it as, how can we intentionally address ourselves towards futures? And a lot of it comes down to storytelling. So there's two kind of points that he's brought up in his research that I really want to go over and make sure we have a good foundational understanding, because it's key to what we're going to talk about next in terms of incidents. So one of the things that he talks about is this idea of the time span of discretion. And it might be hard to see there, but you'll see that this is an axis of scope of responsibility versus complexity of decisions. And on the low end, you've got knowledge worker, individual contributor, right? And then at the other end, you've got sort of the C-suite or the executive suite. Each of those boxes are bounded, or each of those circles are groups of people that are bounded within a box. And those boxes are the time span of discretion. And so the way he describes that is, what is the amount of time that I could do my work and nobody's going to really ask me questions about, like, what are you doing, or can you explain it to me? So for myself, an individual contributor, that time span might be the time span of a sprint. And I might talk to my director. So those are our framings of a lot of our conversations. It's kind of on a 2-week box, right? And then as you move up the graph, you've got, 2 weeks goes to 3 months. for kind of director VP level conversations. For VP C-suite conversations, it's like 3 years, right? So the point that he's trying to make here is that when we look at different roles in an organization, time matters. The types of thinking that they do about how events are going to unfold is bounded by how they think, how far out into the future they think about the particular system that they're in. And so for those of us that are closer to the work, that time span is a lot shorter. And for those of us that are further away from the work, they're thinking about not only longer time spans, but different types of sort of design decisions, if you will. So that's one concept, time span of discretion. The second one is this idea about telling stories about the future. Now, why is storytelling important? What does this matter with respect to incidents? Well, we'll get there. But what he pointed out is that if you look at now and we project forward into time, there are a set of events that we can see that are probable, right? They're basically what we think are going to happen. There are a set of events that are plausible, which means, they could happen, but they're unlikely, right? They're not as probable. There's a set of events that are preferable, and of course, those are encompassed within the things that are probable, right? That are likely to happen. And then there's some things that are maybe implausible. Winning a lottery ticket would be preferable, but it's probably not very plausible. And then, of course, at this outer boundary, you've got a set of things that are possible. And one of the interesting things about that is, of course, this idea that we are living in a period where our notions of what is possible are really being challenged right now. So Jay Bloom says, as we walk through the world, we can sort of think about cognition and what we're thinking about through this frame as a flashlight. We're shining this flashlight on reality. And so that's kind of where our intentionality and our attention are pointed. And wherever we're doing that, there's this whole range of things that are possible, things that are plausible, things that are probable. And then, of course, a goal that we might have of things that are preferable. Okay, so this may be a little confusing. Like how is this applicable in daily life? Why is it relevant? Well, he likes to give the Starbucks example, which is one of my favorite examples. And so every morning, if you go to Starbucks or a restaurant or whatever, but let's say Starbucks, you go to Starbucks and you walk up to the barista and you expect, based on all of the information you have about cultural norms living in our society, marketing, all of those things, about how that interaction is going to go. So you might walk up and you might list off your order for your double half frap cappuccino, hold the whatever. And you expect a set of responses from the barista. If the barista says to you, would you like fries with that? It's going to cause your brain to sort of stop, because the story that you expected to unfold is now been violated, right? It's fallen out of the set of probable things, maybe even, the plausible things, into something that's possible. Certainly the barista can ask you that, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, the reason that this is relevant is because as we go through all of these interactions, whether they be with a barista, with a coworker, with our family, with a partner, there's a set of sort of expected stories that we think are going to unfold. Now, this is actually a cognitive coping mechanism, because it allows us to basically optimize away all of the things that we have to pay attention to. Again, in the Starbucks example, we may really need that morning shot of caffeine. So being able to rely on sort of that story going in an expected fashion helps our brain use less energy, because we can rely on previous experience to sort of inform what's currently happening and also what's going to happen in the future. We can project in the future, and we can do that sort of automatically. We don't have to actually pay attention in the moment and craft our responses uniquely. We can lean on that prior experience. All right, so let's talk about the root cause of stress in incidents. So for those of you that know me, you might be saying root cause. Wait, J. Paul Reed, isn't he the root cause is evil guy? You can see some. I did this Twitter search last night. You can see me railing against root cause. You might be saying, who are you and what did you do with J. Paul Reed? And so I don't mean to imply that there is only one root cause of stress. Of course, that was a bit of a joke. And so as a part of that, I also want to point out in the context of an incident, other causes of stress do exist. One of the things that we wanted to look at here is some of the underlying cognitive sources of stress. But so when we look at other sources of stress in the context of either incident command or an incident responder, there are other solutions as well. And I don't want to discount them. We're not going to talk about them, but drilling and training, being involved in a lot of incidents is going to make you better and reduce sort of that stress. And we'll actually talk a little bit about why. Run books and checklists, those sorts of things can load up a lot of context in our head, make sure that we're checking the right things in the context of an incident. So those can be useful as well. Lots of opinions about run books and checklists in the context of an incident. We won't go into that debate, but they can help with stress, especially if you're newer to incident response. And then, of course, mindfulness or breathing, or take a breath, calm down in the context of an incident can be super useful. Not discounting any of these, but we're going to talk about cognitive stress. So the assertion that I would make to you, based on what we understand about time spans of discretion and storytelling, is that incidents, in effect, are points in time where the stories that we tell each other, and probably more importantly, the stories that we tell ourselves about the socio-technical system in which we exist, are no longer true or coherent. So what do we mean by that? Well, if we go back to this graph that we saw before, our sort of sense of that flashlight in an incident is we expect our system to be in this preferable state. The site is up, it's working, right? And when we roll up to an incident and start that incident response, we may say, oh, it's not in the preferable state, but we may hope that it's close, right? It's in a probable state. There's an easy fix. Maybe somebody did a deployment and it's very obvious that the probable cause, if you will, and that language has some issues with it, but the probable cause of an incident is that deployment, right? So we can look at that. But in an incident, a serious incident, maybe one that takes a long time, a big incident, the actual system state could be over in this realm of possibility that certainly it exists in that state, so it is possible, but it's not where our attention is focused. It's not where the story that we think where that system can move. The system has clearly moved beyond that. So an aspect of this, to sort of give a different sort of framing of it, is our mental model of the system. So this is Adaptive Capacity Lab. So Dr. Richard Cook and John Allspaw talk about above the line and below the line. And this is a really useful model to think about these things, because if you look below the line are the actual computer systems involved, the actual databases and networks and all this stuff. And they exist unto themselves. They have state and they are interacting with each other. And then above the line are sort of the people that are interfacing with these artifacts, and they have their own ideas around what the system looks like, and they need to communicate during an incident about the state of the system and what's going on. And so in incidents, when I say the stories that we're telling each other and maybe ourselves are no longer coherent, that's what I'm pointing out here, is the state of the below the line, the way the system actually currently exists in an incident is different than not only what we are telling each other, right, because there's some confusion there, but also what our mental models are telling ourselves about the state of that system. And that is interesting, and we'll revisit why this is important. So, during an incident, this coordination is cognitively costly, right? So when we actually have to talk to each other, update not only our own mental models, but the mental models of potentially our colleagues, or they're trying to convince us that there's something with the database when we may think it's the load balancer, whatever it might be, right? That coordination and that cognitive work is costly, and therefore it induces cognitive stress in us. In effect, our system asked if we wanted fries with that, and we were expecting to get our latte that morning. So I want to talk a little bit about expertise, because this is the other way that that stress gets expressed. So we're going to talk about Gary Klein and Robert Hoffman's work a little bit about their definition of expertise. And we're going to go through this pretty quickly. So Hoffman and Klein talk about experts using their knowledge base, and that's their knowledge base of experience with the system, but also their experience over a career. It's, you know, what makes us a good SRE or a good DevOps engineer, right, is this accumulated knowledge base. And so they describe this as experts are able to recognize typicality, you know, basically recognize when something looks normal versus when it looks abnormal just by kind of looking at the system. They're able to make fine discriminations. So that means that they're able to fine tune their responses to stimulus and input in particular situations, incident response being a big one. And most importantly in our discussion here is they can use mental simulation. So Hoffman and Klein found out with musicians and firefighters were a couple of the groups they studied. What they found is that really expert firefighters, you know, fire captain crews, can roll up to a fire and they can basically look at the smoke patterns and the burning and what can they see flames versus not see flames, and they can use mental simulation to basically not only figure out how did the system get to this point, where might the fire have started, but they also have the ability to sort of use forward-looking mental simulation to figure out basically how this event's going to go, how the firefighting effort's going to kind of unfold. Experts are also able to apply what are called higher order rules, and one way of thinking of this is basically they know when they can break the rules. The interesting point here is one of the things that makes novices different from experts is everyone can use their knowledge and apply it to derive higher order rules. What makes you an expert is the knowledge base. Your knowledge base is bigger. And so you have more of that foundation to basically look at mental, you know, apply higher order rules, simulate what those are going to look like, all in real time. So why is this stressful, or why is this relevant in an incident? Well, in an incident, all of those futures, and that's what that kind of gray box is, are obscured. An incident forces us to realize not only that the stories, the state of the system as we've told it to each other and told it to ourselves are off, it actually requires us to compress our attention all the way down to just what's happening in the moment. We have to be very present in the moment. We can no longer rely on those common signals and common stories that actually gives us cognitive relief day to day. We actually have to pay really close attention to the metrics. We have to ask questions about assumptions that, you know, I thought this always worked this way. It doesn't seem to be working that way. And then we have to go investigate that. All of that is very, cognitively expensive. The flip side of that is if you look at an incident and ask yourself, well, at what point in an incident do things, you know, get less stressful? Do I feel better, even if the incident is ongoing? Once we can start to effectively project into the future again, once we actually can remove this sort of box and tell a story, and this is, you know, the incident commander or incident responders telling stories to each other. Hey, I think if I do this action on the database, it'll get better. Once we can not only tell that story, but then have that story actually be true, that database rollback actually helps the problem, or adding, you know, scaling in the cloud actually helps the problem. When we can tell a story, have the story actually become true, which means we can project further and further into the future, that's when we get more confidence, and that's when we reduce the cognitive load, because we can start to lean back on our experience with the system, and we can start to lean again on our mental models. They may have been updated in the incident, but we can lean on them again. So I want to walk you through another vignette. I'm going to ask you the same question. Pay attention to what you notice, pay attention to when you notice it, and pay attention to like how you feel about it. Let's look at what happens here. The interesting thing about this video is it's got a lot of actors in it, so it is very much a socio-technical system. So for those of you who know me, know I had to put a flying video in there. But I want to ask a couple things. When did you notice, hey, this plane doesn't look like shouldn't be there, right? If you look at the start of the video, it's kind of hard to tell, like, it just looks like the scenery. So notice, if you watch the video again, notice when you first noticed that the plane looks different. The other thing, though, if you felt stress or suspense watching this plane land, you'll notice that at the end of the video, the incident is not over. There's still a plane on the highway where it very much should not be. You still could have cars crash into it, right? So the incident is still unfolding, but for most folks, as soon as the plane sort of touches down and the cars kind of slow down and make way for the plane, that sense of stress and suspense starts to melt away. And part of that is because, again, at that point, we can project into the future, oh, I think this is how that's going to unfold. And it looks like, the folks on the ground are going to be safe, the pilot's going to be safe. So we do this in incidents as well. Even though the incident may not be completed, we may still be taking remediation against the particular incident. Stress starts to bleed off once those stories and those time spans start to become coherent again. So with all of this in mind, what can we do to tell less stressful stories, as it were? So one of the ways we can do this is practicing what's called interpredictability in human factors. And probably the most important part of interpredictability, it's a component of common ground. I'm not going to go through all of these, but the point that I want to make around interpredictability is being able to sort of have interpredictability with other actors in the system. So one of the biggest examples that we see in incident response, especially with remote incident response, is people leaving the incident or leaving Slack without letting their team know, right? If we look at some of those other things, so that affects interpredictability. If we look at some of those other things, goal alignment and commitment, one of the biggest ones we see there is, how some folks may want to do a deep dive investigation during an incident. You're like, no, we just want to repair this situation and move on, like get our customers back to healthy. And so if there's not alignment on that, then you can have a breakdown in common ground there. And then one of the other big ones is noticing that when common ground and interpredictability is affected or impacted, that you actively repair it. And these are things that you can do outside of an incident. I recently was chatting with some coworkers about the concept of trust. And one of the things that we talked about in terms of interpredictability is I have higher interpredictability with coworkers where I can understand the way, their thought process or their calculus, how they get to a decision. Doesn't mean I actually have to agree with their decision, but I feel like I have interpredictability with them when I can understand kind of the thought process they go through to get to a decision. Learning to move through time, that's another way to reduce cognitive stress. I do not mean like this. What I do mean, and this is especially relevant to incident commanders, is the ability to look at the system from a 5,000 foot view all the way to 40,000 foot view, but in terms of time. So being able to say, if this action that somebody's about to take on the system to fix the database, what do I expect to happen in 5 minutes? What do I expect to happen in 10 minutes? What do I expect to happen in an hour? Being able to move up and down that scale, because a lot, especially as an incident commander, a lot of other folks are going to be focused on the very here and now and moment. Even as an incident responder, being able to move through time sort of seamlessly to figure out if the story is coherent will reduce your cognitive stress, because you'll be able to sort of understand is the action that I'm taking making the story more coherent or less coherent, and what can I expect to happen? How does that feel? Is it moving us in the right right direction. Again, back to this slide, that is the role of communicating, getting all of those different perspectives. A lot of times you'll hear we need to get on the same page, and really in an incident, you want to make sure that not we're on the same page, but we are reading the same book. And so that means that, again, you can look at the longer time spans to figure out, is everybody in the incident response kind of roughly working in the same direction to get you where the system and the group of you need to go. Finally, structural support for adaptive capacity. Again, I want to talk about a little bit, get a sense of your team's current adaptive capacity for adaptation. This is really hard. The reason I bring it up, this is really hard with COVID right now. Probably a lot of you aren't working at 100%, so that can be, you know, a situation you are dealing with. Do you have structural constraints that limit your degrees of freedom? So if you've got security barriers, or maybe you have to get board approval to do deployments, it's gonna reduce your adaptive, or your ability, your capacity to adapt in situations like incidents and that sort of thing. But also, and finally, really importantly, deliberately creating space to share more stories, especially stories that things were really initially incoherent. Like, nobody knew this could happen. It was in that far possibility phase. It's like, wow, you know, how did we get there? That's a way that you can promote adaptive capacity that in the moment of an incident will reduce that cognitive burden and that stress for you. So one more thing, it's relevant to all of our lives. COVID obviously is a thing. That's why we're all remote and virtual right now. Coming back to this time spans of discretion thing, and the stories that we tell each other and share and project in the future, this is what 2020 has done with all of our plans and stories. I'm laughing because our team did a team planning offsite in January, and all those plans are worthless, right? And so one of the things that I want to talk or just mention is that a lot of the stress and trauma that we're all feeling right now have to do with we had to compress our ability to tell stories down from quarter boundaries to, like, I don't know where I'm going to get toilet paper next week. The problem is it's also stressful and painful to actually get back to telling longer form stories. Also, all of these stories that we tell each other are no longer coherent or linked. And so the point here is that COVID, we might think of it as talking about the new normal, but this is an example where if we are going to exit the COVID situation, whenever that happens, and return to normal, we are going to have to rebuild these stories and get back to telling stories to each other on the right period, the right time spans. And that's going to take deliberate work. So a couple of takeaways for the future. Cognitive stress and incidents occurs because our stories have broken down and need to be rebuilt in real time. And this is really difficult. That is a huge cause of cognitive stress. A good incident commander helps the group to effectively accomplish this rebuilding and sharing of new stories that describe our current reality, being that incident. The skills needed to make the stories correct and the mental models coherent, again, can be practiced. You can do this outside of an incident, and therefore, because they can be practiced, they can be improved. And that COVID part, you'll have to craft new stories as part of returning from this new normal that we keep calling it. And so with that, stay safe, stay healthy, stay resilient, and take it easy out there.